people that need the colouring in, so I don't really mind if you need to get colouring in. I apologise, today is not my normal service. I usually do the kids services, and that's fine, but today we're going to try something a bit different and do a bit of an adult service. So bear with me. We're going to look at some, I think, really interesting concepts. Concepts around generosity, concepts around this thing called usury, which actually didn't pop out in that version, but that's okay. And then we're going to look at where all these things fit in relation to the Bible, the greater Bible, but also with Jesus as well. So that's basically the outline of what we're going to do today. On the back of your bulletins, there is roughly a guide. It might have changed slightly. We printed this yesterday. I didn't finish this till about 2 minutes ago. So again, bear with me. Amanda, you give some great insight, and you actually filled out one of the things that I wasn't able to do. So well done, Amanda. So good morning. I hope you're all enjoying your time with God so far, and it's my desire to go through this passage here today and leave you with something to ruminate on, to meditate on, because I think actually that's one of the things that does come out in today's passage. But it's just that one line. It's kind of a throwaway line, but I think it's actually really, really important. And if we look back, we can see a progression of the rebuilding of Jerusalem. So if we look back in the last 4 chapters, and I've kind of highlighted some of the key things there. But it goes back further than that. It goes back to Ezra, the book of Ezra, but it also goes back even further than that to Jeremiah, and it takes in a bit of Daniel as well. And what we're seeing today is a continuation of the Jeremiah prophecy, which says that once returned from captive, so Israel, because they've been naughty baddies, what my kids say, they have been taken away as punishment. And then as they come back, it's taken them 70 years to come back, and then they go through this process of rebuilding the temple. They rebuild the altar. They then go through social and religious reform. And then we find Nehemiah comes along in this third wave, this third part of the prophecy in Jeremiah 29, and he starts to rebuild the wall. And this is so that God can have his city back. It's so God can have his place where his people come and worship him. It's so that God can be seen as being part of the world, the greater world again, instead of his people being a remnant and in exile and away from everything that they know. And so in this, we see that last week in particular, we see that they've embarked on this audacious plan to rebuild the wall, and we've overcome external threats. We overcome threats from outside nations, from people who are living within Judah, but we've also overcome threats that have been born out of hatred. Oh gosh, I've got to remember to use this thing. Oh, we'll get there eventually. And so what happens is, all these people, they've worked on this wall, they've worked day and night, they've worked with weapons in hand, they've slept in their work clothes, and they've had a constant need to defend themselves. And should the worst come to pass while they're trying to complete this endeavor for God, they're going to be able to respond. Nehemiah has come as governor to finish the walls and provide the remaining prestige and security that it offers. And in chapter 3, we actually find a list of people who are rebuilding the wall. And in that, we see that all sorts of people are working alongside each other. We see goldsmiths, we see officials, we see nobles, we see just ordinary lay people who are coming, rebuilding the gates and rebuilding the walls. And as I said before, they've overcome all these external threats. And this is only in the first portion of a 52-day period. So this process of 52 days, they're rebuilding 4-point-something kilometres of wall. It's actually 4.018 kilometres of wall, to be precise. And that's no small effort. Like, they don't do it with cranes like we have. They don't do it with machinery. They don't do it with all our engineering and construction tools and abilities. They are doing it pretty much by hand. That's quite a few skip bins they need to fill. And these walls, they're not like a brick thick. These are 2.5 metres thick. Now, I think roughly 7 foot is 2 metres, roughly. So they're a bit more than 7 foot wide in old money, and they're on average 12 meters high. So that's a significant amount of rubble and a significant amount of material that they need to get rid of. And they've had all these threats to try and stop them from building the wall. And this week, we're finding a new challenge. We're finding that rather than being an external foe that's coming to take these guys and try and stop them building the wall, it's an internal problem. And if we start in verse 1, we can find out where this all happens from. Because it says, now there arose a great outcry from the people and of their wives against their Jewish brothers, against people that they're working alongside. And it's quite concerning because they're rebuilding a wall in a broken city in the middle of a famine, which we find out later on. They don't have enough to eat. They're selling themselves in slavery just to try and feed their family, and they have to pay the taxes to Artaxerxes so that he doesn't wipe them out again. Like, these guys haven't really got it easy at all. They've got quite a struggle ahead of them, and to survive, they're borrowing money from their very own people who are charging extraordinarily high interest. And when they default on that payments, they're having to sell their sons and their daughters and their families into indenture. Indenture it's not an old word, but basically it's a word that means you've got to sell your family into slavery so that you can pay off your debts. And then once they've paid back the money that you owe, then they can be released from slavery. But most families never get out of indentured servitude. And it's happened all throughout history. So the fact that it's happening in Israel is actually quite a significant thing, because what we find, and particularly in some of the older translations of the Bible, so something like the Wycliffe or the King James Version, they use this word called usury. And this word called usury is actually quite important. And it comes from the Torah, would you believe it or not. So it's in Deuteronomy, it's in Leviticus, and it's in Exodus. And the NIV and the ESV, so the versions that are in most common use in Australia today, they miss it out. So you've got the word up there. So it's basically the word interest in verse 7. If you replace it with usury, it kind of has a little bit more significance. It's kind of like saying, if you use the word interest instead of usury, it's kind of like saying the word rain or instead of a drizzle or a downpour. Like, it just doesn't quite capture that same meaning. And so the word usury basically means to charge extraordinarily high interest against the Gentiles. And it's something that the people of Israel have been forbidden to do way back in Exodus, actually. That's the first time they try and do it. In Exodus 22:25, the Lord forbids them for using usury, to charge interest against their own fellow Jews and to extort money off their own people in times of trouble. And this is in the Torah, and in that you move through Leviticus, you move through Deuteronomy, and then into the Nehemiah, and which is the major and the minor prophets, and then you get into the Ketuvim, which is the Psalms and the Proverbs, and where we find Nehemiah today. And usury also turns up in the New Testament as well. Luke 19 and Matthew 25 also have concepts of usury as well. And the practice is forbidden because it puts an added burden upon your people, and it enslaves the Jewish people into basically slavery with each other, which is something that God obviously doesn't want them to do. It's not helpful, it's not beneficial, it doesn't give God any glory, it doesn't serve any other purpose other than to make people rich. And it's wrong. And so when we find that, or when Nehemiah particularly finds that there are people charging usury, he gets really, really angry. Because here he is, he's come back from exile, he's come back from the time when the people of Israel were taken away from Israel because they weren't doing what God wants. And here he finds to be exactly what they left in the first place. And so, again, like, these people know they're doing the wrong thing. They know that they shouldn't be charging usury. They know they shouldn't be charging interest to these people. They know they shouldn't be forcing their people into slavery. And so he gets quite ticked off. And I think he'd get more than just angry. I think if we sort of look back into all this sort of backstory into it, Nehemiah would have been what we would say is apocalyptic. He would have been so angry. He would have been so annoyed that these people are stopping the rebuilding of the wall, because they've gone through all these external threats only to have the thing that really slows them down the most is the people who are hungry, who are starving. They're not worried about trying to rebuild a wall. They're worried about trying to feed themselves, wondering what their family's doing. I mean, could you imagine working alongside the very people who are extracting money from you and trying to do your best work? You've just come back from exile in one of the three waves, and you're struggling to make a new start alongside your fellow Jews, your fellow Israelites. If you come back with hope, you are no longer a slave, but all you are doing is giving your money away hand over fist to keep yourselves out of slavery. Slavery, it seems, is creeping up on you like a very bad smell. And it would be enough to make you scream. Scream like you're being dragged off to Babylon again. So in that, it's something that I think is a really important concept to get across is this concept that the Jewish people are doing this to themselves. It's not something that is an external problem, it's an internal problem. And I think it can relate a lot to what we see in our churches in many ways, but that's not something that I really want to talk about today. But what I would like you to do is when you do leave here today, I'd like you to have a look at Luke 19. I'd like you to have a look at verses, Luke 19, and I'd like you to have a look at verses 1 to 10 and see if there's a parallel coming up. And for those of you who don't know, who can't remember off the top of the head like I can't, it's actually about the story of Jesus and Zacchaeus. So in this next bit, we find that Nehemiah goes away. He's been angry, and then he does something really, really sensible. He actually takes some counsel with himself. And, you could be forgiven for thinking that instead of taking counsel with himself, he'd go away and he'd rage and he'd throw tables and he'd yell at all these people and he'd try and get them to change. But he doesn't. He goes and takes counsel with himself. And if you have a look back at what Nehemiah has done in the past, this isn't just going away and sitting and thinking about it. This is going away and meditating in a time of prayer and fasting. And he does the same when he looks at the walls. He takes away all the external influences in his life and he goes and has a look at the problem at hand. And I think this is quite a profound principle that we can adopt. And if we were looking for a takeaway idea today from this passage, then this could be a good one. But it's not the central passage, it's not the central theme of the idea of this passage, but it is quite a reasonable one. And the culmination of Nehemiah's meditation, of him going away and taking counsel, was to ensure that was for the reason for so that the work of the Lord would continue, and that the people of Israel would be in a better position than when they started with. And so what he does is he holds an assembly and he holds these people to account. He holds them to account to their own laws. So he doesn't create new laws, which is within his reasonable structure as governor. What he does is he brings them back to the old laws. He takes them back to the laws that Zerubbabel, see that's speaking with confidence, talks to them about way back in the end of Ezra, the last chapters of Ezra. And again, these people knew what they were doing was wrong. It wasn't like they weren't aware that what they were doing was definitely not in the words of the Torah. So, as it says in verse 8, they were silent. They couldn't find a word to say in rebuttal once Nehemiah had brought these charges against them. And it's kind of like the little school kid who, you catch out doing the wrong thing. What they do is they hang their head in shame and they mumble. But they don't really say a great deal because they know they've done the wrong thing. And it's the same with these people too. But then what we do is we find at the end of this passage that as Nehemiah has made them aware of what they've done wrong in their life, they say that they will restore everything that they have taken and that they will require nothing from them. And if you sort of think about it, if you think about what happens in Luke chapter 19, like Zacchaeus, when he meets Jesus, he gets profoundly changed, and he restores back to the people what was owed to them as well. And it's that same concept of usury that that Zacchaeus was charging these people when he was doing the tax collecting as well. So it's interesting. I found it really interesting anyway, that there are parallels in the Old Testament and the New Testament. And the more you look for those sorts of things, I think the more they pop out. And I also really like what happens in verse 13. So in verse 12, Nehemiah gets them to restore. They swear to the priest and they make sure that it gets done. But then Nehemiah grabs his garment. And I think this is a highly visual and a highly impactful thing that he does. He shakes out his garment. He sort of adds that finality to it. And in shaking out that the garment, he says, and let God do likewise if you fail to do these things. So it's sort of like saying, if you're not going to do these things, well, then you can get shaken out of here just like the dust that comes from my robe when I stand up and I give it a shake. And you can imagine the people walking away going, oh gosh, do you think he means it? Do you think he'd really chuck us out of the walls? Do you think he'd really cast us out to the Amorites, to the Ammonites, to the Sumerians and the Arabs who've just spent all this time trying to kill us? We've been standing on these walls with weapons in hands. We've been sleeping in our work clothes. We've been sleeping in things just so that we don't. Hey, Celine, how are you? So that we're not taken unawares, And he's giving them this great visual representation. It would be like a great courtroom drama playing out right in front of you. It would be the likes of To Kill a Mockingbird, or A Few Good Men, or a Perry Mason, or maybe a Judge Judy. Well, probably not a Judge Judy, but they do get quite animated in that anyway. Sorry, I've just lost my place, so I'll find that and then we'll get back into it. Hey? But you sort of think, though, like, that's a pretty amazing visual cue to remember as you're leaving this great assembly. And Nehemiah's done quite a significant thing. Like, he's changed the economic climate of Jerusalem and of Israel. I still haven't found where I was, but it's coming. If I turn this page, I might be able to remember where we are. Oh yeah, generosity. So Nehemiah basically goes on to next. What Nehemiah goes on to next is actually showing them how to live his life. And I'm not going to spend a great deal of time on this, because I think that it's something that we as a church have already displayed really well. I think when things get tough, when people are under stress, they're under burden, that we as a church community come alongside and show our generosity. We show our spirit. We show that we can look after each other. And that's what Nehemiah does. In the beginning of verse 10, he and his brothers, so the nobles and the people that he brought back with him from Babylon, they've already started lending them grain. This is before he's already gets them to pay back everything that they've taken. And so he's lent them money, he's lent them grain, he hasn't charged them interest, he hasn't charged them nursery, he's just given them out of his own generosity. And he does this not just for the time of the rebuilding of the wall, so for the 52 days, he actually does this for his full tenure as governor, for 12 years. For 12 years, he doesn't take a tax from the people. For 12 years, he doesn't take any food allowance that he's allowed to take as being the governor. And I think that's really, really amazing. And we find too that this isn't the first time that some people of Israel who are in position of authority have done this. If we think back to Daniel, we see that Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, they don't take any of the choice foods offered by the king. They're just happy to live with what God provides for them. They're happy to live with the food laws that they live for under the Torah. And so it's a similar sort of thing that Nehemiah is doing here. And he does it out of the fear of the Lord. And the fear of the Lord, I think, is quite an interesting concept, but it's one I know nothing about. And it's one I think that if we were really to dive deep into it, I don't think we'd have enough time. And you'd still probably be sitting here next Saturday or next Sunday when Brad comes up to speak again. So in the sake of brevity, what I'm going to do is I'm going to give you some homework. So for all of you out there who are teachers, this is a bit of homework for you as well. Go and find out what fear of the Lord means, because it's something that happens twice in this passage. We find it in verse 15, but I think we also find it in verse 9 as well. And that's what's driving Nehemiah to do all these things, to rebuild the wall, to get rid of usury, to be generous, to be a great leader for his people. Yeah. And so we find that in the end, this passage sort of doesn't really show us a lot about what goes on other than they're rebuilding the walls and they've had some financial troubles. But what it does do is it provides a solid foundation for what is to come. It provides a foundation that lets us know that the people of Israel aren't alone in being able to not live without help. They're not alone in being able to not live without someone guiding them. They're not alone without having the need for significant generosity in their lives. And for us, it's the same as well. We can't live without generosity being displayed to us. We can't live without someone guiding us. We can't live without God's help in our daily lives. And I think that this is probably where the book of Nehemiah fits. It fits in that it's not done yet. You know, we started all the way back in Genesis with the creation of the world. We've gone through Exodus, we've gone through the exile, we've gone through the return, but it's still not what God wants. And the rebuilding of the walls and the challenges that they face are part of that. It's not quite there yet. So in a sense, we're left, again, with the people needing external generosity because they can't do it themselves. So if we think about that in terms of where it fits in the Bible, so Nehemiah fits in, they've been taken away, they've come back, and then it's about 500 years from when the walls have been rebuilt, the temple's been rebuilt, to when Jesus comes along. And when we look at the New Testament and we try and find where Nehemiah chapter 5 fits in, it doesn't. There is no reference. There's no actual reference to Nehemiah at all in the New Testament. There's no reference to Ezra in the New Testament. But these concepts and these values that are being displayed in here and the walls that are being rebuilt are very still much around. So the same walls that Jesus walked through, the same temple that Jesus worshipped at, the same courts where the temple leaders were sitting and giving out their readings of the Torah when Jesus was 12, that's the same temple that's been rebuilt here in Nehemiah. And I find it really, really interesting that it's survived 500 years. Like, that's a long time. We can't even build anything that lasts 10 years most of the time. I certainly can't. So the fact that, you know, they've rebuilt a temple, they've rebuilt a city, and they've rebuilt the walls, and then it still remains standing 500 years later in a turbulent time where there's lots of warfare going on, there's lots of invasions. The Romans come in and invade as well. So this all still standing when Jesus is around. And I think that, in particular, is pretty exciting and pretty fascinating. And so if you want to find sort of something to tie it to, I guess we could look at Luke chapter 2, when Jesus is 12 and he's sitting in the courts of the law. Because if you read that, it says he spent 3 days at the temple. And it doesn't say the Old Testament because it hasn't been written as we know it. What it talks about is this thing called Tanakh. And the Tanakh is the Torah, the Nevi'im, and the Ketuvim, which is basically what we know as the Old Testament today. It's just a bit more jumbled up in terms of how we understand it. And I guess if anything, my point is that Jesus knew this. He would have known the story of Nehemiah. It would have been read to him. He would have seen the walls, and as they were just describing Nehemiah to him, he would have been able to sit there and touch the walls and go, yeah, that's part of my history. That's part of my heritage. That's what God has done to help shape and build the city of Jerusalem. And so in that, what I'd like to say is that yes, there is no concrete, direct evidence between Nehemiah 5 and Jesus, except for the fact that he sat in that place. And the wisdom that he gained and the understanding that he would have gained and the people would have gained from these texts is what came out in their lives. It was what they lived by. They were taught to be generous because of people like Nehemiah who gave what was rightfully theirs to take and gave it to reduce the burden on the people around them. And it's people like Nehemiah who upended injustice for the sake of reducing the burden upon the people of God. And also you can take away these two other things as well. If you've got a big decision to make, seek some counsel. Seek some counsel without external influence. Seek some prayer, seek some fasting, seek some meditation. And two, figure out what fear of the Lord is and see if you can apply those principles to your life. So from today, my point is not to give you some great profound statement about God and the Bible. All I'm asking you to do is to go away to read it and meditate upon it, because Jesus did. He sat in the courts when he was 12 and he learned from the Old Testament. And finally, Paul used to say to Timothy that all scripture was God-breathed. It was useful for teaching and rebuking and for a lot of other things as well. And he wasn't talking about the Bible that we know about today. He was talking about the Old Testament. He was talking about the Tanakh, the Torah, the Nehemiah, and the Ketuvim, and all the books that make up that. And if Paul's saying that to Timothy, then I think that's also a pretty good statement for us today.